So here's why emergency funds just aren't working for you. Now, emergency funds are crucial, but they're not working for a lot of people. And research showed that in the UK, up to about a third, about 34% of adults had either no savings or had less than £1,000 in a savings account. Meanwhile, in the US, about 44% of Americans can't pay an unexpected $1,000 expense from their savings. Now that is absolutely crazy. So in this video, I want to look into why emergency funds are not working for people and what you can do about it. I'm Charlene, I work in banking in London, and I'm an energy healer, showing you how to master your money and energy. So an emergency fund is basically a pot of money that is set aside for emergencies, like if you lose your job or your car breaks. So let's break it down step by step. Here are the reasons why emergency funds just are not working for you anymore. So number one is not having enough saved. So the general rule of thumb for an emergency fund is to have about 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses saved up, set aside in case something happens, like you lose your job or you have it for a rainy day. But to me, I think that it's not enough for most people. I would say it's better to have about 9 to 12 months of an emergency fund just in case, especially if you're doing contract work, you're a freelancer, or you're self-employed, or you have a business where you don't know what your income is going to be consistently. So if you're a contractor, freelancer, or you have your own business, set aside even more money than you think that you need just as an extra buffer. Say in case you don't get your contract renewed, so you're out of a job for another however many months. Also, if you lose your job, it might take you more than 3 to 6 months to get another job, depending on the job market. Also, have a look at if your emergency fund is keeping up with your current lifestyle costs. So if your lifestyle costs are increasing, make sure you're increasing your emergency fund amount to keep up with your changing living costs. So for example, hypothetically, say you had an emergency fund of £10,000 and that was enough for you for 4 months, let's just say hypothetically. Now, say fast forward like 3-4 years later, your lifestyle costs might have gone up. So maybe 4 months of living expenses is now £15,000, for example. So in this case, you might want to increase and build up your emergency fund even more to keep up with your higher living costs. So takeaway action here is to look at whether your emergency fund currently has enough to support your current lifestyle costs, and try if you can to save a bit more than you need. Number two is gifts and holidays. So by gifts and holidays, I mean have a separate fund for gifts and holidays, because gifts, holidays, and Christmas is not an emergency. So I've seen a number of people dipping into their emergency fund to pay for gifts, birthday presents, Valentine's gifts, Christmas, holidays, all these things. And unfortunately, gifts, holidays, Christmases, that's not an emergency. So instead, set aside extra money for gifts, holidays like birthday presents, wedding guest presents, holidays that are coming up, or even setting aside money for Christmas, because all of these costs add up and it can actually be pretty expensive giving gifts these days. Like for example, in the US, the average cost of attending a wedding is now about $580, and in the UK, the average cost of attending a wedding is about £451. So we all know that gifts and holidays, Christmas, we know Christmas comes up once a year, right? We know that birthday presents are going to come up. So it would be good to set aside some money in advance so that you know when your friend invites you to their birthday, you already have a gift and holiday fund that you can draw from. So it won't affect your budget and you won't be looking to dip into your emergency fund to cover these expenses that you know are going to come up. Number three, you dip in and out of your emergency fund. So in my view, what is the point of having an emergency fund if you constantly are dipping in and out of it and basically use the emergency fund as just another current account? Also, in my view, taking money out of an emergency fund constantly, dipping in and out all the time, it can trick your mind into making you think that you're saving, but actually you've been taking money out of that emergency fund so often that it kind of balances out and you're not any better off. So for example, like years ago, there was about a couple of months where I thought, oh yeah, I'm saving a lot, I'm saving regularly, like every month saving a little bit. But because I was actually dipping back into those savings, I actually didn't save that much in the end. Like, it felt like I was saving because I kept automating payments and payments were going into a savings account. But because I kept dipping into it, I wasn't actually any better off. So dipping in and out of your emergency fund or even into your savings account, for example, can mentally trick you a bit into thinking you're actually doing better than you are. So be aware of that. And this leads me to my next point, which is how easy it is to access your emergency fund. So an emergency fund, if an emergency happens, yes, you do want to be able to access that quickly. However, if it's super easy to access, it can also be tempting to use it. So if your emergency fund, for example, is sitting in your current account or whichever account you use to always pay for day-to-day expenses, it can then be tempting to dip into your emergency fund if that's the account that you use for your everyday expenses anyway. But what you can do is hold your emergency fund in a separate account so you don't see it and it's like it's out of sight, out of reach for you to be tempted to use it all the time. Also, having that separation, having a separate emergency fund to your current account can just help you, even as like a mental trick, to help you think that, right, your current account, this is for your day-to-day expenses, and this is your emergency fund, this is separate, this is just for emergencies. So in my view, and what's worked for me, is separating the emergency fund from your current account, or the account that you do your day-to-day expenses from. Next is replenish your emergency fund after you've used it. So this is a common thing that people forget all the time. It's interesting, I hear so much talk about build an emergency fund, but then no one seems to talk about what happens after an emergency happens. You use your emergency fund, and then what do you do? So I find that more often than not, people can tend to forget to replenish their emergency fund after they've used it. So for example, say you have £10,000 in an emergency fund. Great. Then an emergency happens and you use £8,000 to pay for it. So you have £2,000 left. Now, in that case, you want to start making sure that you start to build up your emergency fund back up again to that £10,000 mark. Because if another emergency happens, you might not have enough to cover it. And remember, life happens. Life can throw us curveballs. Your car breaks, you might lose that job. Whatever, life can just throw us things in our way sometimes. So I think that it might be inevitable that you might have to dip into your emergency fund at some point in time, but just remember to replenish your emergency fund after you draw money from it, so that you always have a fully funded emergency fund. Next is having a low account balance. This is a really sneaky one, which interestingly I see has impacted emergency funds, right? So say at the end of the month, before your next payday, you have a very low account balance. So say in your current account where you make your day-to-day expenses, you have £20 at the end of the month, or $50 at the end of the month. In this case, if one more unexpected expense happens, it tips people over into dipping into their emergency fund. So what I would say is, if you can just maintain a minimum balance in your account, like say, for example, you just say to yourself, right, I'm going to always keep £200 or $200 in my current account. And that way, even if there's one unexpected expense that happens at the end of the month before payday, there's a little bit of buffer in your current account, in your account where you make your day-to-day expenses. For me, this was game-changing because it also gave me a nice peace of mind, knowing that in my current account, there is a little bit of a cushion. Not the emergency fund, but it's just a little cushion in my current account, so that even if I nearly use all of the income that I get for the month, there's always something in my account. And it's enough of an amount that I don't feel stressed. I feel financially at ease. And I think that's an issue when people have a low account balance. If every single month you're like, oh, you only have $10, $20 in your account at the end of the month and you're just waiting for the next payday, in that case, that can be so stressful. And financial stress just eats away at you over time. So remember to make your emergency fund work as best as it can for you, by saving enough money into your emergency fund, by having a gift and holiday fund, by not dipping into your emergency fund constantly, looking at how easy it is to access your emergency fund, and are you tempted to always access your emergency fund, making sure to replenish your emergency fund after you've used it, and also keeping a certain amount of money in your current account or the account where you do a lot of day-to-day expenses from, just as an extra financial cushion so you're not tempted to dip into your emergency fund at the end of the month. So here are reasons why emergency funds just aren't working for people anymore and what you can do about it. So if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, it's free and really helps me out, and follow for more on how you can master your money and energy. Let's make this year your best financial year yet.